welcome back to another episode of Words That Kill. And today we're talking war. And our guest is fantasy author David Green, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. So take it away.
Hello, thanks for having me on. Really excited to talk about talk about war. As I say, I write fantasy. I am from Manchester in the UK, but I'm also Irish, and I live in Ireland at the moment.
Okay, so we'll start out by asking how do you craft a war scene? Do societal issues of today play a part in your books, or do you just prefer to pull from historic sources?
Both really. So with the Empire Ruin series, the main empire that's in it is very much kind of influenced by the Roman Empire in terms of how it was like a city-state that kind of expanded rapidly outward and kind of, took over so many different states and nations and peoples and cultures. And it's kind of like a twisted version of that because where the Romans would kind of take things that they kind of liked from other people's cultures and were like, okay, we're doing this now. And okay, we're doing this now. This is what we believe in now. We've forgotten about these things. The Halfveld Empire that I have is very much like, this is our way. You are now a part of us and you do it our way or else. We will make your lives very, very difficult. And that is kind of inspired a lot by like kind of society today, I guess, because I think it's one of those things like, it always makes me laugh when people say like they don't want like politics or people's politics in work. And then they start talking about Star Wars or something like that. Say the new Star Wars films have got too many politics in it. It's like, well, the original ones were about Vietnam. So, it's hard not to do that from what you're living through, right? And, when I was writing the first book in this series, it was during the first lockdown, the first major lockdown that we had during the pandemic, and Brexit was just about to happen. Now, obviously, I'm in Ireland now, so it's just across the water. And then we had all the stuff with like Trump in America and everything like that. So it was hard not to be influenced by some kind of things that were going on that you'd kind of drop in there and find influences by. But yeah, so and obviously then a lot of it is just made up, right? A lot of it is just stuff that I was like, this might be cool. I'd like to explore this. This race doesn't get along with this race, or there's this magical element involved in it as well, where it comes from. So it's always like, you throw a few ingredients into the pot, and hopefully it tastes good once you take it out of the oven.
Okay, so how much does setting and strategy and tactics play into your war scenes and your characters dying off?
Right. The setting plays into it quite a lot, and then also the moment in the story as well. It depends where you want to have the battle. For me, the character is always first. So even in the battle scenes, it comes from a very character point of view. Like, what is the objective of this character at the moment in time? Maybe it's just staying alive, right? And that's a perfectly good objective, but maybe there's other things. And then in Path of War, it opens pretty much with a battle scene, and it ends with a different type of battle scene. But in the first book, it was building towards a siege, essentially, and basically a fight that the people that were defending Solitude, as it was, had no hope of winning, and all of the characters were kind of converging onto that point. So you have to kind of think of it in that way of, what is the setting? It's in a castle. It's in a place that's kind of nestled in a mountain pass that blocks the mountains. So there's only one way in, one way out. So you have to kind of think of the geography of that. And then where are all the different characters doing, like, coming, all converging together? There's people that were already there at Solitude. There's people that are just joining it, and kind of tracking the action and the character beats that way. With the other types of battles, so then in the second book, there's a big battle, which is like kind of a victory for the Halfveldian Empire, but it doesn't really feel like a victory because of the way that it's won. But it's very much like Charge of the Light Brigade kind of thing, where it's like they've got overwhelming odds, and they're just trying to crush this resistance. And then the last battle is more of things don't go completely right the way they think it's going to go, and you kind of bring, and it's something that has been building throughout the whole story as well. So again, that one is focused mainly on just one character, because all the characters are kind of split up. It's like a Return of the Jedi kind of thing, where there's a few different things going on at the ending. But we've kind of just followed that one battle from someone's point of view, and see his kind of emotions and how he feels about this kind of changing tide of war and everything that's going on around him. So they're fun to do, but you have to kind of really, if you are setting it somewhere, you can't just suddenly change the rules, right? So if you're setting it in a valley and there's slopes and higher points, someone's going to take advantage of those, because that's how warfare works, right? And the people that are at the bottom of the basin are not going to be particularly happy about it. And there's a certain way to kind of defend against the charge, and you have to kind of bear all that kind of stuff in mind. Otherwise, it just doesn't feel believable.
Yeah, I believe they called in the bottom of the basin the kill zone in Iron Man 2.
Right.
Too.
Yeah.
So, how do you craft the tension in war scenes that are building up to the inevitable characters dying?
Yeah, so I mean, what you want to kind of do is, like, I mean, the way I kind of approach it, it's that whole thing with what people call plot armor as well. There are some characters that are always going to make it out, because the story has to be about somebody at the end of the day, and you can't just be like killing every character off and bringing new characters in to take over the story at the start of new books or wherever, because people won't be invested in that, and they'll also get turned off to it as well. It's like, oh, another character is dying and what have you. And even like when people talk about like George Martin and people like him, he kind of slows down on the killing of the main characters quite a lot. He settles into a nice little rhythm where well, these people are going to be around a long time. So what you have to kind of do then, is there needs to be a certain level where there's a certain amount of people that are safe, but then no one else is safe, right? And you've got to make that, again, feel believable. But the characters that you want to keep around, you have to make sure that things happen to them that change them as characters, either that as a mental aspect or a physical aspect, right? They can't always escape unscathed from situations. So when you're kind of leading up to like a battle scene, or you're at the battle scene, you have to make sure that they're not always in control of the situation, that they have a certain amount of peril that they think is in front of them. There is something that they come up against, odds that there is that reasonable doubt where you think, hang on a second, like, how are they going to get away with this? But also, you can't make it like it's just unbelievable that they've got out of it as well. You have to give them the tools to kind of deal with it. So a lot of the work goes in before the battle scenes or before the war scenes, where you have to kind of show like what this character is, what this character is capable of, and the character's mental state going into one of these things, because that's one of the things I try to explore with Path of War. Most of the big war scenes are from the point of view of a character who's kind of a minor character in the first book. He's the master of war for the Haltveltian Empire. So he pops up a few times in the first book, but he's quite a major character in the second book. And he is a non-magical person, and he is a very able fighter. And he kind of straddles the line between sanity and insanity, and it's something a few characters kind of comment on quite a bit. And you see it in the book when you read it as well. But he is very devoted to his empire and his emperor in particular. But they're bringing in like this new weapon, which is a magical kind of weapon. It's, I think, called a Shadow Sparker, which is their kind of magical unit. And the character Nexes, he is obsessed with these, replacing people like him in warfare and making people like him obsolete. The first battle of the book, these Shadow Sparkers completely just obliterate the opposition, and it kind of unnerves him because he's kind of like, you know what, I'm going to be the next one who's replaced that. I've replaced people for my empire, and I've seen it done, and I've done it, and I'm next. This is my last campaign. So it's kind of like a descent into madness and paranoia throughout the book for him, and then when it culminates in this battle at the end where you'd think that the odds are in the Halbertians' favour, even though the reader knows a little bit more about a few things than the characters do, but you still think, they'll be all right with this, but there's a twist. And it kind of then you see the change in the character where what you've kind of been building up for throughout the whole book. Spoilers for the book, he comes alive, but he's not unscathed. He is very, very changed by the whole experience.
Okay, so how do you craft the battlefield death scene? Do you prefer a quick pace, or do you kind of pull it out a little bit?
Yeah, it depends on who it is, really. And again, the circumstances. I think there's a real fear of a really quick death. I know a lot of people always say that, like, in war movies and other things, like, give me a quick death, and that's what they want. But as a reader, when you're attached to someone and someone is just breathing 1 minute and they're not, that's a huge shock. It's a huge, because the reader wants to say goodbye to characters, right, a lot of the time, and you don't give them that opportunity, and they want to see other characters be able to say goodbye to each other as well. There is that where it's just like, just that quick, they're gone, right? And that's a useful tool to use, and it's a really good one to kind of use to kind of really get under the skin of the reader, which you kind of want to do in some situations. But you also have to know when the time is right to give someone a goodbye as well, right? Sometimes the characters have earned it and the readers have earned it as well. But it's a tricky one that you have to do. I've done it both ways in Solitude. I did it, in Solitude and in Path of War. There was a kind of big death at the end of In Solitude Shadow, where my editor was kind of, please consider doing this in a different way, because I just can't bear what has happened. Right? And I was like, and I stuck to my guns. I was like, no, because it's part of the character's arc and other things to do with that. And that's just life. Sometimes you don't always get to say goodbye and what have you. Whereas in the second book, there was a certain death that happens, and it's in more of a skirmish, where I wanted to do that kind of more of a slower one, where they get to just say goodbye to each other, because I think I wanted to do it, and I felt it was the right thing to do as well. So it's different tools that you've got, and it's just, you have to kind of judge it and see. You can't do all of one and then none of the other. You have to get that balance of them correctly.
Okay, so how bloody do you go when you're doing these death scenes in the battlefield, and what is the bloodiest one that you've done?
I'm one of these people that has blood and gore in it, but that I don't shine a huge lens on it. I don't spend a lot of time describing everything. Like, I don't describe like a sword like just cutting right through someone and everything that kind of happens falling out the left and right, unless I have to, right? So I have done it, but I don't do it with everyone. I try to be like realistic and kind of like brutally realistic, So if, like, I wouldn't say that someone's been shot with an arrow, I will describe how the arrow's punctured an eyeball and it's come out. I'll be like, realistic enough. With these books, in particular, war has become such a common thing, and death has become such a common thing, like by normal means, like swords or fists or whatever. People are kind of not desensitized to it, but it's almost expected. And when you bring in the magic side of things, then, which is something that in this world has only ever really been used for defensive purposes or for healing, and they've started to use it as a weapon, you want to really kind of describe that and really kind of get that shock that the characters see when it's used in a certain kind of way. So those ones I will go into quite a bit of detail on it, but mostly again from the character's point of view, how they're reacting to what they're seeing or feeling, or if it's being used on them. Like especially in Path of War, I kind of have a torture scene as well, which is, it's not particularly graphic. It doesn't really kind of leave anything to the imagination, but it's from the characters, the person who's carrying out the torture. It's from their point of view. It's their kind of mental state, and so you don't really want to pull any punches. I find, because I think it weakens the stakes of what everyone is going through sometimes. But I also think that you don't want to have to describe it every single time someone dies, because otherwise it just gets a bit
Yeah.
boring.
Okay, so you mentioned magic on the battlefield and it being used as a weapon. So, how would the opposing forces defend against that magic, or did they have any defense?
That's a spoiler.
Okay.
But to kind of answer that in a way is that yes, but I am very. I think this is either from the way like my brain is wired, or maybe from growing up playing video games, but maybe both. But I always think that if you introduce an element that has a lot of pluses and a lot of strengths, it has to have some kind of weakness as well. And there must be something else, an opposing force that is able to go up against that thing that you introduce. And you don't have to introduce them both at the same time, obviously, because that would just be a bit silly. Like, so you can have this new thing come in that people are up against and they're not sure how to defend against it, and they can find a way to defend against it, or to attack in a different kind of way. And that's like, escalation of powers, and you have to be careful with that as well, because especially with magic, because you don't want to make people too powerful, which I think is one of the things where you have to kind of come up with these natural and organic checks to the things that you are bringing in. One of the series that I always kind of think of when I think about that is Raymond D. Feist's Rift War trilogy, the original trilogy, and it extended into the saga as well. Because Magician is one of the books, like a really kind of formative book for me. It's one I really love. But I Will Die on the Hill that Pug and Thomas are way too powerful by the end of the first book, like way too powerful. They're both basically gods by the end of the first book, and then the next two books in the trilogy, and then in the rest of the saga, whenever they're back again, Feist is almost coming up with reasons for them not to be around, because they could just turn up and solve every single problem that they have, because they're basically unstoppable forces of nature. That's one of the things that you kind of have to think about with magic, I feel, is that what is the balance to the thing that you're trying to introduce?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's
I know that the feeling. I had two gods go to war in one of my books, and I had to work on that scene for a long time, so they just didn't basically destroy the entire world while
right,
they were fighting.
right, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, because
it's these logistics that you don't even ever think you're going to think about, and you're like, hang on a second.
I had to write a second book, so I needed a world. What about the aftermath of war and the emotional consequences of the soldier? How do you deal with that?
Basically, that's what the second book of my series is about. It's called Path of War, and so they're all every character is on the path of some kind of war in the book. The other character, who is the Master of War, Nexes, who I was talking about before, the reason I started with his arc in that book with a battle and ended it with a battle was because I wanted to explore what a person like him, a very powerful person and a very sure person, what would happen to that character when you change the parameters of what he is an expert in, and when you kind of pull the rug out from under him a little bit and take power away from a very powerful person, how that would change someone and how he would look at war after that, which is the thing that he exists for. So there's a few different things that you kind of look at it, and it's again, you're looking at it from a very kind of character perspective. With the third book, I've done a few, like, I've done the climactic battle, I've done the opening battles, and there will be more of a time inside the book for characters to kind of react to things that happen that way. But it's kind of like the Malazan books in a little way, where it's just, there's a constant grind, there's constant, well, what's the next battle? What's the next battle? And you have these characters that are like, well, we're done here, but we're going off to this other part. It's just all part of the process, and that is just their life. And it's interesting to kind of explore that. And because obviously there are career soldiers, and that is their life. And it's interesting to kind of look at that and see when you change, because obviously with fantasy, there's always going to be some kind of war element. And I think it's very interesting when you change that element of war, the rules of war, to see how people react to that.
Yeah, it's sort of like in real world where they went from swords to gunpowder to guns. It changed the face of war. So yeah.
Yeah,
Did you?
exactly. Yeah. Like when the tanks first came into World War One, and the French were charging at them with on horses and swords, right? And they still did it at the start of World War Two as well. And it's kind of like, and you kind of want to look at that and kind of make it more immediate. So it's kind of like, instead of like having that kind of change over like 10 or 15 years, it's like an immediate kind of like, oh, there's something new here right now, and you have to react to it, which you can do in fantasy. That's the great thing about it.
Okay, and speaking of different sorts of weapons, when you were researching conventional weapons and using them in your book, what kind of limitations and advantages and lethality did you find? And what did you use?
With the epic fantasy ones, they're kind of set in like, the setting of it is very kind of Southern European inspired, like, but not medieval. It's kind of pre-industrial. So it's the weapons are pretty much what you would expect: swords, and there's rapiers, and there's short swords and long swords, and then there's. But I kind of wanted to bring a lot of other things in, like, which I don't really see a lot in fantasy, like maces, which were very well used in Southern Europe. Other things like that. So the mace was an interesting one just to kind of look at, because I didn't want to kind of describe it as if someone was using an axe or a club, because they're used very, very differently. There's a different weight distribution to them, and obviously because of the spikes that are on the mace, like, they can get stuck in things, and there's a certain way that you would use it and twist with the wrist to kind of get them out of the way. And it's one of those things where it's like you just mention it in like a line in the book, but if you didn't mention it in that line, that one person that would read it, who is an expert in using that weapon, would be like, that's not how you use that weapon, right? And I saw a discussion recently about people, some readers were saying that, like, you can always tell a fantasy author who's never ridden a horse before, because the way they kind of describe how to look after the horse in between, like, or whatever. So it was one of those where it's like, well, I just need to put this one line in here about how you kind of twist the wrist and do this, because that one person that knows will be like, okay, well, they researched it out. That's good.
Yeah, and that's, as an author, if you've never ridden a horse, you just write in a little assistant to yourself who's the horse's groom, who will take the horse off and
Right, yeah.
off page.
They have a squire. The squire
Yes.
looked
Yeah,
after
the
the horse.
squire looked after the horse. There.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the most interesting or oddest weapon that you have researched?
I think Excalibur would probably be the oddest one, really, because like I was kind of looking at. I had an image in mind of how I wanted to kind of use it in my urban fantasy series, because the character in that doesn't think that magic exists in the world, and he's very, very cocksure about how things are. He mentions in this book how he was an atheist in the first place, and then he realized heaven and hell exist, so he shouldn't really be so sure about what he believes in, because he's been proved wrong on a massive scale already. So I kind of wanted to kind of like get Excalibur in a kind of wanted to bring in more fantastical elements, because it is urban fantasy and it starts off very kind of paranormal detective kind of way, but there was always that plan. There was characters that had swords, and those characters that did certain things, and there were certain creatures that were very fantastical, but I wanted to kind of bring that in and bring in like relics and other things. And I'm a big Arthurian legends fanatic, and I've been since I was a little kid. So I was always like, I'd like to bring Excalibur in at some point and like make it a bit of a joke as well, where it's like where Nick Halloran goes to someone because he's just completely out of his depth, and he finds out about this person called the Collector, who is like an expert in relics and hell and all this kind of stuff. And the guy offers him to use Excalibur, and Nick Halloran's like, you know what, you're wasting my time. Like, I come here asking for help, and you tell me about a fairy tale about some sword that was in a stone. Like, so I was like, what can I do that's different to what other people have used Excalibur for before? Like, in different kind of ways. I've seen it done like in a chalice. I've seen it used in a shield. So I saw all sorts of stuff. So I was researching it for ages, just looking at different ways of people doing it. I think I came up with a pretty novel way of using it. At least I hope so. Although what will happen is the book will come out and someone will send me an email saying, did you read this book? Because they did Excalibur the exact same way as you did. And I'd be like, no, I did not read that book, but thank you for telling me.
Okay, so we'll end on one last question. What is the most creative death you've done to a character?
I think that would be the end of In Solitude Shadow, and it's not because it's like gruesome or gory or anything like. It's quite the opposite, but it really kind of culminates in like the entire book. This death is kind of pulls like all the themes that are in the book and all of the characters together, and it's something that the characters have never seen before as well. So it shocks the characters when it happens. And it really kind of sets up for where the story is going to go. So it does like a lot of stuff, this one death. And it was one of those things where I was like, I knew where it was going when I was writing the story. But I was always getting up to like this bit and I was like, if I don't pull this off, the whole book doesn't work. Right. And it was my first epic fantasy book as well. So it was a lot of like kind of pressure that I put on myself to kind of construct the book in such a way where it's like everything's rested on this one bit, and if it doesn't work, then the rest of the book is like, well, that could have been okay if this bit worked. But yeah, I think I pulled it off, and so that's probably the most creative because so much work went into it and so much thought went into it, and just making sure all the pieces work together and the emotional aspect of it was working, and the awe of it, I suppose, from the rest of the characters and the impact that it has on the moment that it happens, and then afterwards as well, going into the second book, the impact that it has. And a few people that have told me they've reread the book, they say that like it makes them appreciate the rest of the book a lot more as well, because of like they can see other things that were like they might have missed first, or other things that they were like didn't realize tied in with it. So that one would probably be the one. So it's like I'd probably say it's one of those ones you save the best one till last, but I kind of just went with the first one. I just was like, well.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for being my guest. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, it's you. Always a pleasure.
Okay, and that's the end of this episode, and be sure to join us for the next episode of Words That Kill. And bye for now.
Void eyes fixated on Vedigan, a look of deranged glee, no, desire etched into her ruined face. Vedigan shook, eyes wide with fear, shock, and disbelief plain in his features. Haven't you heard? Ganton said, licking his lips. He hadn't even dismounted. Changes in the air.
You understand the plan, yeah? Colleen rolled her eyes when Mark scowled. What? Do you get it or not? It's not much of a plan, is it? Well, you haven't exactly come up with anything better. If Mark could have folded his arms, Colleen reckoned he would have. Instead, he frowned down at his one arm, like the sight of its asymmetry still offended him. It's just that, in theory, this plan isn't a plan, it's an objective. Get in, blend in, keep our heads down, find Maria, and get out of there. I get it. Don't even disagree, I can't disagree. He shook his head, jowls wobbling. It's the how exactly are we going to do all that? That's the part I don't understand. God's teeth, this is your drocking friend, not mine. They fell silent, and it wasn't a comfortable one. Since the raid at the Broken Bard, Colleen and Mark had kept to the rooftops, hiding in the shadows as they watched the comings and goings of the Patriarch's palace. They'd seen the Emperor's hand who'd confronted them entering the gates, along with a sizable contingent of guards not long after their fracas. They'd had Maria in tow, and they hadn't seen them leave. Mark had wanted to press the attack right away, and Colleen had asked just how long their little rebellion had lasted with such reckless thinking. Surely it wouldn't last much longer.